Today's read aloud is called Discovery and Danger on the Prairie. All right, I need you to tell me, where is the Atlantic Ocean? Point to it. Atlantic Ocean is over here. What about the Appalachian Mountains? Right there. Mississippi River? Right there. Rocky Mountains? Over here. How about the Louisiana Purchase or the Louisiana Territory? Right between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River. What about the Missouri River? The Missouri River, remember, it connects to the Mississippi River in St. Louis, and it goes out towards the Rocky Mountains. What about the Pacific Ocean? Over here. So today's read aloud is going to take place in a part of the United States that we now call the Great Plains. The Great Plains are over here in the Louisiana Territory. While not a lot of pioneer families who lived in the United States traveled into the Louisiana Territory, many Native Americans had already been living there for a very long time. What did Lewis and Clark do to prepare for their expedition? They recruited skilled men to be part of their corps of discovery, and they gathered supplies they would need, like special boats and tools. I want you to listen carefully to find out which two tasks Lewis and Clark will have the opportunity to accomplish and whether or not they're going to be successful. On July 19, 1804, William Clark found himself at the edge of an ocean. It was not the Pacific Ocean, the vast sea to the west, that Clark and his friends had hoped to reach. In fact, it was not an ocean of water at all. It was a large, flat area of land covered in grass called a prairie. A prairie is also called a grassland. I want you to think about the grassland habitat that you learned about in the Animals and Habitats domain. It was called the savanna. A prairie goes on as far as the eye can see, just like an ocean. So the prairie looked like an ocean because it went on as far as you could see, just like an ocean seems to when you look at it. Clark was out hunting for the expedition and spotted some elk tracks, which he followed up a hill. He later described what he found at the top. I came suddenly to an open and boundless prairie. I could not see the edges in any direction. This was so sudden and entertaining that I forgot about the elk I had been following. Clark had reached the eastern edge of what today we call the Great Plains. Wild grass as high as Clark's knees stretched out and blew gently in the wind, interrupted every so often by a hill or a grove of trees. The sea of grass stretched all the way to the distant Rocky Mountains, which it would take the Corps of Discovery weeks more to reach. Remember that the Corps of Discovery is the group of people who were traveling with Lewis and Clark. During those weeks, the explorers saw many plants and animals that were new to them. Meriwether Lewis was especially fascinated, or very interested in, the pronghorn antelope, called pronghorns for short. He tried to get close enough to draw pictures of them, but the pronghorns always ran away. The pronghorns had incredibly sharp eyesight and a strong sense of smell to warn them of approaching danger. When Lewis finally came close enough to a pronghorn and got a good look at the long, curved horns that give the animal its name, he wrote, "The speed of this animal is equal, if not superior, to that of the finest racehorse. The pronghorn is my favorite of all the animals we have encountered so far." The explorers were also astonished by the prairie dog, a tiny rodent. These little creatures, related to squirrels, lived together by the thousands in what the men came to call prairie dog towns. The prairie dog towns consisted of underground tunnels that sometimes stretched out for miles across the flat plains. "We have to catch one of these to send back to President Jefferson," William Clark declared. But catching a prairie dog was not so easy. One prairie dog, standing guard above its hole in the ground, saw the men coming and chirped a high-pitched warning. Instantly, all the creatures dived down into the ground. The men dug down after them, but found that the tunnels went down more than 6 feet below the surface, spreading out in all directions with emergency exits to escape their many predators, hawks, coyotes, and snakes, all of whom considered prairie dogs to be delicious snacks. Clark wrote down their findings about the prairie dog and pronghorn antelope in his journal. Still following the Missouri River across the prairie, the expedition moved on. Soon, they began to meet new tribes of Native Americans. Most were friendly and welcoming, especially the one tribe called the Yankton Sioux. A few of the Yanktons guided or led the travelers for a few days, but then said, "You are coming to the land of the Teton Sioux. We will not be able to guide you any longer." Lewis and Clark had already heard about the Teton Sioux. President Jefferson wanted them to become friends with the Teton Sioux. However, the Teton Sioux were not interested in trade with the settlers and did not want to allow Lewis and Clark on their land. One September afternoon, John Coulter, one of the expedition's best hunters, was following the tracks of an animal. Coulter dismounted from, or got off of his horse, to look more closely. Some Teton Sioux, hiding among the nearby trees on their own horses, shouted and rushed forward, riding off with Coulter's horse. Coulter walked back to the river and reported to Lewis and Clark what had happened. Minutes later, 5 Teton Sioux appeared on the shore, calling out to talk to Lewis and Clark. Captain Clark answered, "We will not speak with you until our horses returned." Minutes later, more than 200 Teton warriors, all armed with bows and arrows, rode out from the trees and spread out along the riverbank. Warriors are people who fight in the battle. The Teton Sioux were prepared to fight to protect their land. Captain Lewis remembered that President Jefferson wanted them to be friends with the Teton Sioux. He quietly ordered, "Stop the boats and hold them steady here in the middle of the river." Clark, smiling, called, "We come as friends from our great chief." The chief that Clark was talking about was President Jefferson. "We invite your chiefs to come and see our great boat." Clark ordered a few sailors to row him to shore in a pirogue, and after greeting the 3 main chiefs, Clark brought 2 of them aboard the keelboat. There, he and Lewis were friendly to the Teton Sioux and gave them gifts. Then, Clark and the oarsmen took the chiefs back to shore. Meanwhile, Captain Lewis stood ready on the keelboat's bow, and his soldiers kept rifles in their hands or right by their sides in case of trouble. Everything seemed to be going well until suddenly one chief shouted, "Your gifts are not good enough. You may not return to your big boat until you give us better gifts." Sioux warriors grabbed the pirogue's rope and held it securely. Clark knew that the Teton Sioux honored courage. The Teton Sioux admired and respected people who acted bravely. If he showed any sign of weakness at this moment, the Tetons might attack. Even if there were no fight, any chance of a strong friendship with the Tetons could disappear. Clark whipped his sword out and, holding it high, firmly demanded, "Release our boats at once." Back on the keelboat, Lewis ordered his men, "Prepare arms. Only on my order may you fire, and not a second before." Instantly, the soldiers raised their rifles. In answer, the Tetons raised their bows and set arrows, ready to shoot at the Corps of Discovery. No one moved. The silence stretched out for a long, tense moment. Then, a Sioux chief told the warriors holding the rope, "Let go." They obeyed. Clark told his oarsmen, "Return to the keelboat." One of his men asked quietly, "Without you, sir?" "I gave you an order," Clark said in a voice that sounded much calmer than he actually felt. Oh, sorry, that was the picture for what I just read. So you can see he took up his sword and they put up their arrows, and then back here in the back you can see the men who are holding up their rifles. As the Pigru pushed off from the riverbank, Teton warriors surrounded Clark. Lewis could only see his friend's hat over the shoulders of the Sioux. Lewis gave orders, and as soon as the Pigru reached the keelboat, a number of armed soldiers got into the Pigru and started back for Clark. But then, suddenly, the Tetons moved away from Clark. Clark's bravery had impressed the Tetons. The Tetons thought that Clark was brave because he stood up to them. They smiled in friendship and invited the members of the expedition to their village. The explorers accepted the invitation. The Corps of Discovery had survived a dangerous situation. What they did not know was that even greater dangers and even greater victories still lay ahead. Okay, it is question time. What is the area called where today's read aloud took place? The Great Plains. What kind of animals did Lewis and Clark encounter? Prairie dogs and the pronghorn antelope. Before Lewis and Clark's exploration, pioneer families living in the United States had not explored or settled the Louisiana Territory. Who had been living on that land for thousands of years? Yeah, many Native American tribes had been living there for a really long time. So this picture over here shows a picture of the Yankton Sioux, and this is the Teton Sioux. So in their read aloud, Lewis and Clark met two different Native American tribes, the Yankton Sioux and the Teton Sioux. How were their meetings with the two tribes different, and how are they the same? The Yankton Sioux were friendly and they guided the Corps for several days, but the Teton Sioux, they weren't so friendly at first. The Teton Sioux were prepared to fight the Corps. Eventually, both of the tribes became friends with Lewis and Clark, though. Which of President Jefferson's tasks did Lewis and Clark accomplish in the read aloud? So what of the three tasks, what did they accomplish? What did they do? Lewis and Clark, they accomplished two tasks, making friends with Native Americans and encountering, but only making notes rather than collecting new animals and plants, right? They couldn't catch the prairie dogs or the pronghorn antelope. So the title of this read aloud is called Discovery and Danger on the Prairie. What do you think was discovered and what that was new to Lewis and Clark, and what was dangerous in this read aloud? Lewis and Clark, they encountered a new landscape, the prairie, and they encountered new animals like the prairie dogs and the pronghorn antelopes, and they were in a dangerous situation when the Teton Sioux, who were ready to fight them, right? All right, it is word work time. So in the read aloud, you heard Clark knew that the Teton Sioux honored courage. Say the word honored with me. Honored. 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 What is the root word of honored? So what word do you hear in the word honored? You hear honor. When you honor something, you respect or admire it. The Native Americans in the read aloud, they honored courage, meaning they respected and admired people who had courage. I honor people who are kind. What kind of people do you honor? What's the word we've been talking about? Honor or honored. All right, guys, remember, honored or honoring means that you respect or admire it, okay? All right, go check out your assignments for today, and I will be seeing you soon. Bye.